When we think of those who live and work behind a prison's walls, we usually have a fairly clear mental picture of who the good guys and bad guys are. The good guys are the ones who keep the inmates safely locked up behind metal bars, while the bad guys are the ones serving time for often unspeakable criminal acts. But sometimes the good guys fail us. They reveal themselves to be men of little moral substance. And other times, the bad guys surprise us. They turn out to be more caring, empathetic, and, well, human than we first thought. Perhaps the best example of this is the Ohio State Penitentiary fire of 1930. The penitentiary, built in 1834 on Spring Street in Columbus, was actually the fourth building for inmates constructed in the area over a period of less than 30 years. The first jail in the city had been built in 1804, a simple two-story log stockade surrounded by 13 whipping posts. Even this primitive structure had a reputation for unusual cruelty. Men, women, and children alike were brought there, stripped of their clothing, and tied to the posts. The whippings that followed left their backs raw, but the pain was nothing compared to the application of hot ash and coal to the bleeding skin that followed. In 1813, the first state prison was built at the corner of Main and 2nd Streets, with 13 cells and 2 floors. But within a year, the new structure was full, and the General Assembly commissioned a second building at the site, designed to hold an additional 100 prisoners. Those condemned to spend time there lived in unheated cells, slept on straw mats on the floor, and battled massive infestations of rats and outbreaks of cholera. In antebellum America, a new era of prison reform resulted in a massive increase in incarceration. Reformers believed that deviant citizens must be removed from society to avoid infecting others with their immorality. These unsavory characters were placed in corruption-free environments called penitentiaries to learn vital moral lessons that would rehabilitate them so they could safely re-enter society. To accommodate the growing number of inmates in need of moral rehabilitation, the legislature approved the construction of a 500-bed penitentiary on Spring Street. Though designed to be a model institution of the new reform theories, any moral improvements prisoners experienced at the facility were undoubtedly only a credit of their own individual fortitude. The prisoners labored in complete silence during the day and were locked in solitary confinement cells at night. Their diet consisted of small portions of cornbread, beans, and bacon served on rusted tin plates. The prisoners were issued blankets only in winter, and bedding and clothing were rarely washed, as laundry facilities were non-existent. There was no medical treatment to speak of, and disease tore through the prison in unmitigated outbreaks. In 1849, a cholera outbreak killed 116 prisoners while the guards fled the grounds. Punishments included dunking the prisoners in vats of water, hanging them by their wrists, and forcing them into the sweat box, where stifling temperatures led to dehydration, heat exhaustion, and even death. Though it was common for prisoners to die in these conditions, the spectre of the afterlife loomed much larger when the penitentiary became the de facto site for executions in Columbus. The gallows were relocated from a ravine near the present-day intersection of Mound and 2nd Streets to the end of the penitentiary's East Hall in 1885. 28 convicts were hanged there, including a 16-year-old boy. The gallows were replaced with the electric chair in 1897, but the new device caused even greater unpleasantness for prisoners and guards alike. No longer the job of a singular hangman, every guard took a turn in these new executions. These so-called death house duties included sitting with a prisoner during their last meal, fastening the convicted into the straps on the chair, and pulling the switch that would end their life. $75 of overtime pay was split between the attending execution officers. But even during the leanest times of the Great Depression, guards did all they could to avoid the work. 315 men and women were put to death in the electric chair at the Ohio State Penitentiary between 1897 and 1963. The presence of the execution device widened the gulf between guards and prisoners, each uncomfortable with the role they played in a macabre operation. But even Old Sparky, with its menacing leather straps and metal brackets, was a more pleasant way to go than the horror endured by the hundreds of prisoners who died on April the 21st, 1930. By then, the penitentiary had been in a near-constant state of construction, repeatedly expanding to house the ever-growing population. It was now suitable for up to 1,500 inmates, but at the time of the fire, it held 4,300. It is believed that a small group of men within these overcrowded walls were planning an escape and hoped to distract the guards' attention with a small fire. The blaze began on some scaffolding erected on the west block of the prison, where a candle was placed near a bundle of oily rags. If the theory about prisoners starting the fire is to be believed, they likely intended the flames to spread as the men took their evening meal in the dining hall around 4:30. But the fire didn't erupt until an hour later, when the prisoners were being led back to the cells for the night. The cell block adjacent to the burning scaffolding housed 800 prisoners, and many were already locked in. When smoke began pouring into the stone building, the terrified inmates begged to be released so they might escape the flames. Not only did the guards refuse, they continued to lock up as many remaining prisoners as possible before fleeing themselves. As the fire spread, the heat welded cell locks shut, turned iron bars a glowing red hot, and cooked the trapped prisoners where they stood. Some prisoners escaped by swinging onto the scaffolding and climbing down to safety. In the midst of the confusion, one prisoner pulled on civilian clothes and walked away. As a hastily assembled armament loaded rifles aimed at the fleeing prisoners to prevent them from escaping the prison walls, a number of unlikely heroes emerged. Not among the guards who refused to hand over their keys, but among the condemned, who refused to let the ones they labored next to in silence each day die alone. A handful of men who managed to escape overpowered a guard and took his keys. They dashed back into the flames, unlocking as many cells as possible, helping the wounded to safety and attempting to put out the fire to prevent its spread. A bank robber, dubbed Big Jim Morton, carried 20 men to safety. Inmate Pat Sword collapsed in exhaustion after rescuing 12 prisoners. Convicts in the Company K group, classified as incorrigibles and denied most common prison privileges, were among the first to organize a rescue attempt. They ran again and again into the building, battering down doors and carrying out victims on stretchers taken from reluctant firefighters. More prisoners waited near the exits to move the injured to the cooler parts of the courtyard for treatment. Again and again, men deemed too dangerous to be a part of society drove back into the flames to save lives. A few guards, emboldened by the heroics of the prisoners, reluctantly began assisting in the rescue by handing over their keys and unlocking doors and smoke-clogged cell blocks. The fire had started in a construction area full of lumber, sawdust, tar, kerosene, and other accelerants. It spread quickly as firefighters fought through the confusion in the yard below. They struggled to connect their hose lines as they were surrounded by angry prisoners who didn't believe they were working as quickly as they could to save those still trapped inside. Some picked up rocks and pelted the firefighters as they worked. The roof collapsed about half an hour after catching fire, burning 160 prisoners trapped in their upper cells to death. Chester Himes was serving a sentence for armed robbery at the penitentiary during the fire. Himes would later become an acclaimed novelist, but one of his first widely read pieces was a feature for Esquire magazine. The short story was titled "To What Red Hell" and told the story of the fire in striking detail. He wrote, "The sights of convicts who were in for murder and arson, who had shot down policemen in dark alleys, who had snatched pocketbooks and run, who had stolen automobiles and forged checks, who had mutilated women and carved their torso into separate arms and legs and heads and packed them into trunks, now working overtime at their jobs of being heroes, moving through the smoke with reckless haste to save some other bastard's worthless life. White faces gleaming with sweat, streaked with soot, white teeth flashing in greasy black faces, all working like mad at being heroes. Some laughing, some solemn, some hysterical, drunk from their momentary freedom, drunk from being brave for once in a cowardly life." Healthcare professionals were called to the scene to assist with injuries, but their supplies were woefully inadequate. Local radio stations broadcast a call for help, and volunteers arrived with bandages and hypodermic needles. As the rescue attempts were abandoned due to overwhelming smoke and the collapse of the roof, guards began herding the prisoners into a tight cluster and surrounded them with guns. Every foot of space along the prison walls was guarded by machine guns and rifles. Over 500 local police officers, prison guards, and soldiers had formed an armed battalion to keep the prisoners in check. None had moved to help rescue the trapped inmates or assist the injured survivors. The first bodies were brought out just after midnight, and prisoners were led back inside to find beds in cells now drenched and flooded with standing water. The dead were transported to the cattle barn at the state fairgrounds, where physicians attempted to identify them. Shipping tags bearing only their prison numbers were affixed to their bodies. Family members of the prisoners gathered en masse outside the prison gates, desperate to hear if their loved one had survived. Guards trained their machine guns on the crowd to push them back, as the captain in command of the night watch was escorted away by a cordon of police fearing attack. Radio stations broadcast that all prisoners who were safe would send word soon. The next day, prison officials sent hundreds of telegrams and answered thousands of phone calls. When all prisoners had been accounted for, 322 men were dead. Another 230 were injured, many severely. In the 2 weeks after the fire, the surviving inmates refused to go back to their labour in protest of the guards' callous disregard for human life during the fire. Officials transferred 600 inmates from the penitentiary to London Prison Farm to alleviate tensions and overcrowding, but no transfer of prisoners could shield the warden and guards from the storm of scrutiny brewing outside of prison walls. An investigation into the fire initially concluded that the blaze resulted from faulty wiring, but as news stories were published detailing the cowardice of the guards in comparison to the heroics of the prisoners, the state fire marshal quietly opened a second investigation that fixed responsibility onto the prisoners themselves. 2 of the 3 prisoners blamed for the fire took their lives in the months following the tragedy, leaving many to speculate that the second investigation was a cover-up meant to deflect attention away from the prison officials' incompetence. But regardless of the cause of the fire, there was no denying that overcrowding had exacerbated the tragedy. As a result of the public outcry, the state legislature established the Ohio Parole Board in 1931. Within a year, more than 2,300 prisoners were released from the Ohio State Penitentiary on parole. Several of the men who helped rescue trapped prisoners the night of the fire were given pardons. But the horrors were not over for those who remained incarcerated at the facility. The conditions of the building deteriorated and overcrowding continued to be an issue. By 1955, the population had swelled to over 5,200. In 1968, a series of riots led to over $1 million in fire damage, with prisoners destroying 9 buildings and damaging 6 more. That same year, inmates took 9 guards hostage in a 28-hour standoff that ended with a forced invasion that killed 5 prisoners. Following the incident, the governor ordered a new maximum security prison to be built in a rural part of Ohio, and the penitentiary was placed under permanent lockdown. In 1972, most of the prisoners were transferred to the new facility in Lucasville, with only the sick, psychotic, and worst behaved left in the old compound, which was now mostly charred remains of rot and decay. The last inmate at the Ohio State Penitentiary, now operating under the name Columbus Correctional Facility, was moved in August 1984. The halls that had seen 150 years of torture, fire, riots, and disease now sat silent. For a decade, the dilapidated husk became a local destination for those hunting paranormal activity or urban exploration. There were stories swapped about the spirits of the angry and sinister men who now haunted the area, and some even claimed to hear the crackle of fire and screams from dying men if they lingered too long in the old prison yard. Eventually, the building was torn down and the site was used to build a sports arena. Today, few who pass it realize the spot was home to the worst prison fire in United States history. But if they linger in the parking lot, they may hear the sounds of lumber crackling or the faint screams of men burning alive, echoing across time. Thank you for watching. Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story that will make you say, "Well, I never."